The moment I realized someone inside my family was lying to me, it wasn't because of a confession. It wasn't because of a missing fortune. It was because of a single question asked across a dinner table. The dining room of our estate had looked exactly as it always had that evening. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow across the polished oak table. The fireplace crackled softly against the silence that often settled over old houses after sunset. Family members filled their usual places. Isabel sat beside David, pouring wine with effortless grace. Victoria watched everything with her usual composed expression. Eleanor remained beneath the chandelier, quietly avoiding eye contact with anyone for too long. James moved through the room with the precision of a man who had spent decades serving the same family. Ethan, my grandson, sat halfway down the table, unusually quiet. I had built companies, negotiated billion-dollar contracts, and survived more boardroom battles than I could count. People often called me the most powerful man in the room. What they never understood was that power teaches you to recognize silence. Real silence. The kind that hides something. Halfway through dinner, Ethan finally spoke. His voice was calm, almost casual. "Grandpa, did the Harbor Trust transfer go through the way you wanted?" The room froze. It happened so quickly that most people would have missed it. Isabel's hand stopped for half a second while pouring wine. David looked down at his plate. Victoria reached for her glass before Ethan had even finished speaking. Eleanor's shoulders tightened. I stared at Ethan. "What transfer?" I asked. He blinked. Genuine confusion crossed his face. "The one with your signature," he said. "I thought you approved it last month." My signature. Those two words echoed in my mind. I had approved no transfer. Not last month. Not this year. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Isabel smiled. It was the kind of smile people use when they want a conversation to disappear. "I'm sure it's just paperwork," she said lightly. The discussion moved on, but I didn't. I continued eating. I continued listening. I continued watching. Around me, the family carried on as though nothing unusual had happened. But I could feel it now. The invisible tension beneath every word. The carefully controlled reactions. The shared understanding I somehow wasn't part of. By the time dinner ended, I already knew one thing. Someone inside this house had used my name. And for the first time in many years, I started wondering whether the greatest threat to my family wasn't outside our walls at all. That night, I did not go to bed when the rest of the house went quiet. Instead, I remained in my study overlooking the east lawn, sitting in the same leather chair I had owned for nearly 30 years. The grandfather clock beside the fireplace ticked steadily through the silence. I kept replaying Ethan's question in my mind. The Harbor Trust transfer. My signature. The confidence in his voice when he mentioned it. Ethan was not careless. He was observant, thoughtful, and far too intelligent to invent something like that. Shortly after midnight, I unlocked the cabinet where I kept copies of every major family document. The system had not changed in decades. Every trust, every property agreement, every investment record was organized with meticulous precision. That was why the missing file stood out immediately. There was an empty space between two folders. Small, almost invisible, but I knew exactly what belonged there. Harbor Trust. I stared at the gap for several seconds. Someone had removed the file and expected me not to notice. Most people probably would not have. At my age, many assumed I spent my days reminiscing about the past. They forgot that I had built an empire by noticing details others ignored. The next morning, breakfast felt strangely normal. Sunlight poured through the tall windows of the dining room. Isabel discussed a charity event. David glanced repeatedly at his phone. Victoria criticized the financial news. Eleanor quietly stirred her tea. No one mentioned the previous evening. No one mentioned Harbor Trust. Yet the silence felt deliberate, as if an agreement existed that I had never signed. After breakfast, I crossed paths with James in the main hallway. He had served this family for more than 20 years and understood things without needing explanations. He looked at me carefully. "Everything all right, sir?" he asked. "Tell me something, James," I said. "Has anyone been using my office recently?" For the first time, hesitation appeared in his expression. It lasted less than a second, but it was enough. "A few people have stopped by from time to time," he replied cautiously. I nodded and thanked him. He walked away, but the answer stayed with me. A few people. Not one person. Not an accident. Not a misunderstanding. By late afternoon, I stood alone beside the library window watching rain clouds gather over the property. Somewhere inside this house, someone had access to documents they should never have touched. And for the first time, I began to suspect that whatever was happening had been happening for much longer than anyone realized. The following evening, I decided to stop looking for answers in documents and start looking for them in people. Records could disappear, files could be moved, but human behavior always left traces. Dinner was served at 7, just as it had been for years. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows while the chandeliers cast long reflections across the oak table. Everyone seemed relaxed. Too relaxed. Isabel spoke about renovations to a property in Vermont. David nodded along, although he appeared distracted. Victoria maintained her usual calm authority. Eleanor barely touched her food. Ethan watched everyone more than he ate. I spent most of the meal listening. It was remarkable how much people revealed when they believed nobody was paying attention. At one point, David mentioned a meeting that had supposedly taken place 3 weeks earlier. He stopped himself almost immediately. Isabel smoothly redirected the conversation before anyone could ask questions. Most families would not have noticed. Mine had become very skilled at changing subjects. After dinner, I made my way to the West Wing where several administrative offices were located. Very few family members had reasons to visit that area. The hallway was quiet. The lights were dim. As I passed a conference room, I noticed something unusual. A calendar hanging beside the door displayed a series of initials written in pencil. Most had no meaning to me. One did. Harbor. The word had been partially erased, but not completely. Someone had tried to remove it. I stood there for several seconds, studying the faint marks. The timing matched the missing file. The transfer Ethan had mentioned. The questions that were multiplying faster than the answers. The next morning, I received an unexpected call from Sophia. She was a young attorney who occasionally assisted Thomas with specialized legal matters. Her voice carried an unusual seriousness. She asked if we could meet privately. We agreed on noon. When she arrived at the estate, she carried only a slim folder. No dramatic expression, no grand announcement. She simply sat across from me in the library and placed the folder on the table. "I am not sure what this means yet," she said carefully. "But several transactions connected to family assets were processed recently. The paperwork appears legitimate. The approvals appear legitimate. Everything appears legitimate." She paused. "That is exactly what concerns me." I looked down at the documents. Every signature looked like mine. Every authorization appeared authentic. Yet I knew with complete certainty that I had never approved any of them. For the first time, a troubling possibility entered my mind. Someone was not merely hiding information from me. Someone had built an entire system designed to make me believe events had happened exactly as planned. After Sophia left the library, I remained seated for nearly an hour staring at the documents spread across the table. Outside, the afternoon sky had darkened into a blanket of gray clouds that hung low over the estate. The house itself seemed quieter than usual. Not peaceful, watchful. Every hallway felt as though it contained conversations that stopped the moment I approached. Every room carried the weight of things left unsaid. That evening I requested copies of visitor logs, access records, and internal schedules from the administrative office. The request was simple. The reaction was not. By dinner, word had somehow spread that I was reviewing old records. Nobody asked me directly why. Nobody needed to. Isabel became unusually attentive, asking whether I was feeling well. David appeared distracted and checked his phone repeatedly. Victoria spent most of the meal discussing market conditions and economic forecasts, as though determined to fill every silence before it became dangerous. Only Ethan behaved normally. He seemed unaware of the tension growing around him. Later that night, I sat in the security office reviewing archived camera footage from several weeks earlier. Most of it was uneventful. Staff moving through hallways. Deliveries arriving at the front gate. Family members coming and going. Then something caught my attention. There was a gap. Nearly 40 minutes of footage missing from a Tuesday afternoon. Not corrupted. Not damaged. Removed. I checked another camera. The same gap. Then another. Again, the same period of time had vanished. Someone had carefully erased a specific window from the system. The following morning, I met with James in the conservatory overlooking the gardens. He listened quietly as I described the missing footage. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he looked toward the glass ceiling above us and sighed. "Sir, I have worked here a long time," he said carefully. "People tend to notice what changes. Sometimes the more important thing is noticing who never changes. The statement stayed with me long after he left. That afternoon, I reviewed years of family records, meetings, and correspondence. Certain names appeared again and again around major decisions. Certain people were always nearby when important documents changed hands. The pattern was subtle, almost invisible, yet once I saw it, I could not ignore it. What disturbed me most was not that someone had manipulated records. It was the realization that this operation required patience, planning, and trust. Whoever was behind it had been standing inside my circle for a very long time. 2 days later, Ethan knocked on the door of my study just after sunrise. The estate was still quiet. Morning light stretched across the hardwood floors, and a thin layer of fog lingered beyond the windows overlooking the grounds. He closed the door behind him and placed a small stack of printed pages on my desk. His expression told me he had not slept much. "I think I found something," he said. During the past week, I had intentionally shared very little with him. Not because I did not trust him, but because I wanted his observations to remain independent from mine. Sometimes the clearest evidence comes from people who are not looking for it. Ethan explained that he had been reviewing archived correspondence connected to several family projects. Nothing confidential, nothing unusual, at least not at first. Then he noticed that certain messages referenced meetings that never appeared on official calendars. Names appeared repeatedly. Dates matched periods surrounding the missing documents and altered records. More interestingly, the same small group of people always seemed to be involved. I studied the pages carefully. There was no dramatic revelation, no obvious confession, just patterns. Consistent, quiet patterns. In business, patterns often matter more than individual events. One mistake can be accidental. 10 similar mistakes rarely are. Later that afternoon, I walked through the East Gallery toward the private family offices. As I passed a conference room, I heard voices inside. The door was not fully closed. I could not make out every word, but I recognized David's voice immediately. He sounded frustrated, tired, pressured. Another voice responded calmly. "Isabel." The conversation stopped the moment footsteps approached from the hallway. By the time I entered the room a few minutes later, both were gone. The chairs had been pushed neatly into place. The table was spotless, yet a legal folder remained on a side cabinet. Someone had forgotten it in a hurry. Inside was a draft proposal involving trust restructuring. The document itself was incomplete, but one detail caught my attention. Several recommendations would have gradually reduced my direct oversight without requiring my immediate approval. Individually, the changes appeared harmless. Together, they would have shifted enormous influence over time. That evening, I sat alone in the library while rain tapped softly against the windows. The house felt different now. Not because new secrets had appeared, but because old ones were beginning to take shape. Every clue pointed toward careful planning. Every discovery revealed another layer beneath the surface. And the more I learned, the more convinced I became that someone had spent years preparing for a future in which I would stop paying attention. The breakthrough arrived from the person I least expected. 3 days after Ethan showed me the correspondence records, Eleanor asked whether we could speak privately. She rarely initiated conversations. For years, she had mastered the art of remaining present without becoming involved. That was one reason people underestimated her. We met in the sunroom overlooking the southern gardens. The afternoon light filtered through the glass ceiling, casting long shadows across the wicker furniture. Eleanor sat quietly for several moments before speaking. "There is something you should know," she said. Her voice carried a weight I had not heard in years. She explained that nearly 2 decades earlier, shortly after a major family restructuring, disagreements had emerged regarding future control of certain trusts and assets. Nothing public, nothing dramatic. Most of it had been handled behind closed doors by attorneys and advisors. At the time, everyone assumed the disputes had been resolved. According to Eleanor, they had not disappeared. They had simply gone underground. As she spoke, names surfaced that I had already seen repeatedly in documents and records. The same individuals, the same relationships, the same circles of influence operating quietly around important decisions. None of it proved wrongdoing, but it revealed something more important. History, patterns stretching back years before the Harbor Trust issue ever appeared. "Why tell me now?" I asked. Eleanor looked toward the garden. "Because I think someone assumed you would never connect the pieces." After our conversation ended, I spent the evening reviewing archived board minutes, legal summaries, and estate planning documents. The deeper I looked, the clearer the picture became. Small decisions had consistently benefited the same interests. Administrative authority had gradually shifted in subtle ways. Certain recommendations had always originated from familiar sources. The strategy was remarkably patient. No single action attracted attention. No single decision appeared suspicious. Only when viewed together did the pattern emerge. Late that night, another unexpected development occurred. Thomas called. As the family's longtime attorney, he rarely contacted me outside scheduled matters. His tone was unusually serious. He informed me that Sophia had uncovered additional records connected to recent asset transfers. The transactions themselves were legal on paper, yet several supporting authorizations appeared to rely on assumptions about future approvals that had never actually occurred. When the call ended, I stood alone beside the library fireplace listening to the quiet crackle of burning wood. For weeks I had been chasing scattered clues. Now those clues were beginning to align. And the most unsettling realization of all was this. Whoever designed the scheme was not reacting to opportunities as they appeared. They had been planning several moves ahead the entire time. The next step was not to confront anyone. It was to create an opportunity for someone to reveal themselves. By then I had learned enough to understand that the people involved were careful. They would not make mistakes under pressure. They would make mistakes when they believed they had already won. That realization shaped everything that followed. On Monday morning, I instructed Thomas to arrange a formal family meeting for the coming weekend. No explanation, no agenda, only a simple message that I wanted everyone present at the estate. News traveled through the house with remarkable speed. Before noon, Isabel stopped by my office carrying coffee and asking whether everything was all right. Her concern seemed genuine, but her timing interested me. David called twice that afternoon. Victoria requested a private conversation. Even Eleanor appeared surprised by the sudden gathering. Only Ethan seemed excited. He assumed I was finally preparing to address the growing tension surrounding the family business. I allowed everyone to believe whatever they wished. During the following days, I quietly observed the reactions. The changes were subtle but impossible to ignore. Conversations ended when I entered rooms. Meetings appeared on calendars and disappeared hours later. Staff members mentioned seeing family members in parts of the estate they rarely visited. The atmosphere felt less like a family home and more like a company awaiting a major announcement. 2 evenings before the meeting, Sophia arrived with another collection of records. Together we reviewed transaction histories, approval chains, and internal communications. The evidence continued to point toward coordination rather than coincidence. Yet one detail stood out above everything else. Several key decisions had only occurred after information from my office became available to a small group of people. Someone had been anticipating my actions before I took them. That discovery narrowed the possibilities considerably. Late that night, I walked through the grand dining room alone. The chandeliers were dark. Moonlight spilled across the long oak table where generations of family discussions had taken place. I stopped at the chair where I usually sat and looked around the room. For years, I had assumed loyalty was the foundation of this family. Now I understood something different. Loyalty had become a performance. The real alliances existed beneath the surface, hidden behind polite smiles and familiar routines. When Saturday finally arrived, every member of the family gathered exactly as requested. They believed they were attending an important discussion about the future. In reality, they were stepping into a situation none of them expected. Because by then, I was no longer searching for clues. I was waiting to see who would react first when the bait was placed directly in front of them. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of quiet anticipation that settles over a house before a storm. The entire family gathered in the dining room. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the long oak table. The fireplace cast a warm glow across familiar faces. Isabel sat beside David with her usual composure. Victoria appeared calm and confident. Eleanor remained reserved. Ethan watched everyone carefully. Thomas and Sophia occupied seats near the end of the table. I allowed several minutes of ordinary conversation before standing. The room fell silent immediately. I have been considering the future of the estate, I began. Every eye turned toward me. After many years, I believe it is time to reduce my direct involvement in several family trusts and holdings. The reaction was subtle but unmistakable. David looked surprised. Ethan looked confused. Isabel remained perfectly composed, but her attention sharpened instantly. Victoria leaned forward almost imperceptibly. I continued speaking. Over the next few months, authority may be transferred to a smaller leadership group. The words were intentional, carefully chosen, vague enough to invite assumptions, specific enough to trigger reactions. Throughout the remainder of the meeting, I watched more than I spoke. Questions emerged. Suggestions followed. Certain family members appeared eager to discuss structures, approvals, and responsibilities that had not even been mentioned. Others seemed unusually prepared with recommendations. By the end of the evening, I had learned more from their reactions than I had from weeks of documents. After dinner concluded, guests slowly dispersed throughout the house. Conversations continued in hallways, sitting rooms, and private offices. Exactly as I expected, Sophia remained behind with Thomas and me in the library. Within an hour, reports began arriving. Several calls had been placed immediately after the meeting. Messages had been exchanged. Meetings had been scheduled for the following week. Activity increased dramatically the moment the possibility of transferring authority entered the conversation. The bait had worked. More importantly, it had revealed something unexpected. The people I initially suspected most heavily were not driving events. They were reacting to them, following them, taking cues from someone else. That realization changed everything. Near midnight, Sophia placed a folder on the desk between us. New records, new communications, new connections. This time a single name appeared repeatedly at critical moments stretching back years. Not in the spotlight, not making decisions publicly, always nearby, always informed, always present when important information changed hands. I stared at the documents for a long moment. The pieces finally fit together. And for the first time since Ethan asked that simple question across the dinner table, I understood that the true architect of the deception had never been standing at the front of the room. They had been quietly directing it from the shadows all along. The final meeting took place 1 week later in the same dining room where everything had begun. The chandeliers glowed above us. The long oak table stretched across the room. Every member of the family was present. This time, however, the atmosphere was different. People sensed that something had changed. The uncertainty that had quietly spread through the house now sat openly at the table with us. I allowed the silence to settle before speaking. Then I began reviewing a timeline. Not accusations, not opinions. Facts, dates, transactions, meetings, authorizations. One by one, Sophia and Thomas presented supporting records. Documents appeared on the table. Communications were explained. Patterns were outlined. No dramatic confrontation was necessary. The truth had become too organized to ignore. I watched the reactions carefully. David looked stunned as connections he had never fully understood became visible. Ethan listened with complete attention. Isabel remained composed, though her confidence slowly faded as the scope of the scheme became clear. Victoria sat unusually still. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, as though finally seeing a burden come to an end. Then the final piece was presented. The evidence showed that many of the questionable actions had not originated from those who appeared to benefit most. Instead, they had been coordinated through a trusted figure who occupied a position close enough to monitor information, influence decisions, and guide events without attracting attention. For years, that individual had quietly shaped outcomes while others unknowingly followed the path being created for them. The room fell silent. Nobody argued with the facts. Nobody challenged the records. The truth spoke for itself. What surprised me most was not the deception. It was how ordinary it had seemed once exposed. No grand conspiracy. No dramatic takeover. Just years of small manipulations accumulating until they formed something much larger. When the discussion ended, immediate changes were announced. Trust structures were reviewed. Oversight procedures were strengthened. Authority was redistributed through transparent safeguards. The system that had allowed secrets to grow was dismantled. As family members slowly left the room, I remained seated at the end of the table. Ethan approached before everyone else departed. "Did you know how this would end?" he asked quietly. I looked around the room one last time. "No," I said, but I knew the truth would eventually reveal itself. After he left, I sat alone beneath the fading chandelier light. The estate was finally quiet again. Not because every problem had disappeared, but because illusions no longer occupied the space where trust was supposed to live. And as I looked across the empty room, I realized something important. I had never lost control of the situation. I had simply waited long enough for everyone to reveal who they truly were.